Welcome to In Between Artists, a podcast about navigating sustainable creative careers. I'm your host, Stephanie Brown, and an interdisciplinary artist. I've been pursuing my own art career for 12 years and counting. This podcast is a space where I hope to help you pursue your own. An In Between Artist is someone just 5 to 10 or even 15 steps ahead of you. Someone not so far ahead that they can relate to where you are and provide meaningful and fresh insight. This podcast will feature honest and accessible conversations with guest artists. We'll talk money, navigating obstacles, building networks, and more. This podcast is designed to help aspiring, active, and dormant artists alike kickstart, revamp, or endure their art and design careers. Identify your future mentors and a custom creative career path right here on In Between Artists. Welcome to another episode of the In Between Artists. I'm your host, Stephanie Brown, and I'm excited to have with me Shane Darwent. How you doing, Shane?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Where are you joining us from?
I'm in my studio in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the Arts District right downtown.
Okay. Where's home for you, Shane?
My wife and I bought a house in a sweet little craftsman neighborhood down the street from our studio here in Tulsa. So I came here about 6 months after grad school to join the Tulsa Artist Fellowship in 2018 and have been here for 6 years now. So this is
incredible.
Home. We have a son. He's in school, and here we are
doing the whole thing. Sweet. Well, we're going to jump back to the Tulsa Fellowship because I definitely identify that as a big milestone in your career. For those who don't know, Shane and I went to graduate school together. So I had the pleasure of meeting Shane at University of Michigan, Stamp School of Art and Design, and Shane was just 1 year ahead of my cohort. And it's been a pleasure just getting to know your work and seeing it grow, but also as of late, seeing it in storefronts and just really amazing, beautiful, like architectural photography of your sculptures and your pieces. Tell us a little bit more about what brought you to University of Michigan and maybe even a little bit of your academic career prior to. Were you always involved in the arts? Did you always know you wanted to be an artist? How did that roll for you? What events kind of happened and culminated to like bringing you to a graduate art program?
Yeah, so I did go to an art school for undergrad. I got my BFA at Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, and I was studying photography and then sort of like photo printmaking. MICA was the only art school that I applied to, and I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, so I knew I wanted to sort of like get out of that part of the South, and I knew that I wanted to, whether it was sort of like going to school for arts or the other path was going to school for business, which is really funny because now it's both, but I would never identify as like a business major, but I just knew that I wanted to sort of like carve my own path. I guess that's what was interesting about sort of the idea of like business, just in that I would get to set my own rules, or in theory get to set my own rules. So fortunately I got into art school and didn't go to Eastern Carolina University and studied business. I was at MICA for 4 years and then was working at a printmaking studio in New York afterwards. And I just kind of like, for like a decade after undergrad, kind of was like behind the scenes in the arts, working for that printmaking studio. I was an artist assistant for several different artists for the next few years. I did picture framing. I worked in sort of like freelance sort of preparator sort of roles, kind of like
these were essentially all your ways of making money, like during undergrad and post undergrad.
Totally. Well, I guess one of the sort of like stops along that sort of like, I was out of undergrad for like a decade before deciding to apply to grad school, but one of the stops along that route was being a core fellow at the Penland School of Crafts.
Oh wow.
Which was a really amazing experience. I was basically in New York working at a printmaking studio for 1.5 years after undergrad. And it was hard to balance a full-time job there with also sort of like the dedication to making my own work. and I was seeing sort of how easy it would be to just to go to the exhibitions and openings and sort of be a part of the scene, but not really make time for my own work. Um, so I was trying to look for like an off ramp from like the full time sort of like, New York grinds, which I could see occupying the next 20 years. So I found out about this place called Penland through a previous instructor
Yeah.
from Micah, who had gone down there to be with his wife while she was either taking or teaching a bookmaking workshop.
Okay.
And it was this sort of like utopian ideal of like these like beautiful old buildings in the mountains of Western North Carolina, and you could take sort of craft-based workshops and media from blacksmithing to paper making to glass blowing to wood sculpture and traditional woodworking, um, and traditional printmaking like I was doing in New York. And so I applied to and got into the core fellowship at Penland, which was a 2-year gig where you lived in this sort of old cabin with like 9 other core fellows, and you worked part-time for the school in exchange for getting to take these workshops, which were anywhere from like 2 weeks to 2 months.
Did they supply housing?
Yeah, they supplied housing. It was like a MTV Real World situation where 9 complete strangers from all over the country showed up and sort of like lived in this like 100-year-old sort of like cabin in the woods together. And it was like in the Blue Ridge Mountains, like very sort of mountainous and rural, but really, really beautiful. And so that was like this incredible sort of like glimpse into how artists are sort of like surviving through, lots of the artists at Penland are sort of like making sort of, the jewelers sort of like making sort of like functional wearable art, the ceramicists sort of making sort of like functional pottery, blacksmiths sort of making, really beautiful architectural work for clients. So it was like in contrast to like the contemporary art scene in New York, it was a little bit more like everybody there were artists, and they were all sort of like patching together a living and figuring out sort of like ways of surviving. So it was lots of artists and arts workers in service of a smaller pool of big shots, and sort of more like, oh, we're all artists and we're all sort of patching together this like way of surviving.
I just wanted to highlight a couple things because I think what's really key, and I encourage artists to do this all the time, is that like you continued, even with that long span of time between undergrad and graduate school, you continue to immerse yourself in the arts, or like, keep your financial pathways around the arts. But the benefit too is like even hearing all the different things you were exposed to is fascinating. Like just thinking about your work now and how some of those things might have informed the way you started to change, like thinking about your art practice.
Yeah, totally. I never wanted to go to grad school. I I always thought that like there was enough sort of opportunities for exposure outside of it, and I never sort of, I didn't necessarily align myself with sort of like an academic sort of way of thinking about work. I like going to Penland was sort of a sort of in rebellion of sort of like being in sort of like a heady sort of New York space for a couple of years after being in sort of like a conceptually minded sort of like undergrad program. And so it was really sort of like a sort of response to that, but all the while sort of like, I never identified as like a crafts person per se. Like, I wasn't necessarily just interested in sort of like traditional methods of making. So I always sort of identified sort of with this person that was somewhere in between the sort of like the Chelsea gallery artist in New York and the sort of the rural studio sort of artisan in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Like I've always sort of like had a push and pull between both of those sort of spaces.
And you never had like an interest of being in New York full time or anything like that. It sounds like you kind of enjoyed living in that middle and having a choice as to like where you were being situated.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a push-pull, love-hate. Like, I've lived in New York 3 different times now, and sort of like every time I leave, I'm like, I'm never ever going back there. But it's incredible, and it's like incredible artists from all over the world and incredible galleries and museums and institutions, obviously. And so it's like, as an artist, you can't not contend with it. Um, and I love going back and spending time there, but I think I just was responding to not necessarily wanting to live there
Yeah.
full time.
I feel that. I mean, my husband's
Yeah.
from New York, and it's just like, it's great to go and like
Totally.
take advantage of its resources for as long as you're able to. But to live long term, yeah, that's a hard.
It's just hard. Yeah. Yeah. Unless you really sort of, shoot out like a rocket, or you just sort of like grind and grind and grind and grind for years. And I've always sort of valued a little bit more quality of life.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it was like, it checked a lot of the boxes, but not all of them. So I'm constantly sort of trying to find what that in between space is.
So what happened? What was the switch that happened that made you actually consider graduate school? Since that wasn't something that you were originally interested in, and it had been 10 years since you were formally in a program.
Yeah, so my wife and I found ourselves living in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which was a really sweet, sweet place to be. We had, I guess we met at Penland. We had sort of rambled all around the country, moved to Chattanooga, lived and worked for a while, went back. She got into FIT, so
Okay.
we were back up in New York for a while, and then we decided we wanted to go back to Tennessee again, just doing this kind of flip flop. But when we were back in Tennessee the second time, basically I had started sort of my own picture frame shop to support my studio. So I was like building picture frames and custom panels for artists, to sort of pay for my studio rent, basically, and pay for our sort of home rent. But I got to the point where I felt like I was sort of like doing a lot of sort of like service for other artists
And not enough service for yourself.
not enough service for myself. And I was applying for a lot of the same sort of grants and sort of public art opportunities and projects that like a lot of the folks that I was sort of building frames for were like, I was connected to the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga sort of like artist community, and I was peers with a lot of the faculty, but I was like making their picture frames, and I was like coming up with excuses to curate shows to be able to sort of like have them as clients. And it was like, it just seemed, and then I had been working sort of long term for part-time for sort of a mentor artist, Andy Saftel, in the Sequatchie Valley in Tennessee. And he's like my father's age, and I had sort of like learned a ton from him. But I was like, I had sort of been putting all of this work into sort of like presenting projects for other artists and sort of framing their work.
Right.
And I feel like I'm like, if my work isn't where theirs is, I need to sort of figure out how to shift things so that it can get there.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like, grad school could, be that opportunity to, I mean, certainly if I could find a program that was funded, and that I wasn't
That
going to
helps.
go. Yes.
And unfortunately, just got to make a disclaimer, the Stamps School of Art program is no longer fully funded. But at the time, that was also a big draw for me too. It's a gamble to go to graduate school, especially as an artist. It's different if you're trying to become a professor or something like that. But
Right.
for the ways in which you were interested in utilizing grad school is very similar to how I was looking at, going to grad school. And that's an expensive gamble. And there's less funding available for graduate students, especially in creative programs. So yeah, it being fully funded was a game changer.
Yeah, I think that for Elspeth and I, my wife, whenever she was helping me look, that was a prerequisite for us. And I had gone, Micah is not sort of like a big state school with a lot of funding. It was an expensive private art school, and I knew that like I just couldn't financially do that or justify it, knowing that I wasn't going into grad school to try to get the teaching position or the administration position. It was to just grow the studio practice, which at best would be speculative,
Yeah.
post grad school. So it was really important that, yeah, we find a program that was that was funded. And also, like, the other thing that I was looking for in a program is I had gotten a really strong studio background at Micah, and while it sort of leaned conceptual and sort of New York centric in certain ways, um, there was a really incredible technical emphasis as well. So between my time at Micah and the Prince Studio in New York, and then at Penland, and being an artist assistant for so many years, I had just a really strong foundation of making. I could make things. I could build stuff. I had the sort of the technical chops, but what I was lacking was the sort of the academic foundation for the interests that I had all these years.
And like verbalizing it, explaining it.
Exactly. Writing about it, talking about it, understanding the sort of historical context of it. So Michigan just seemed like a great fit for that.
I love that. Another thing to highlight too is I love the different categories of things that you were looking for in a school, and knowing when you wanted it. I've got lots of people who ask me all the time, like, "Oh, I think I'm going to go to grad school," and I cringe.
Yeah.
Like, I would never like voluntarily encourage any and all artists to go to graduate school. I think you really need to be ready to go. You need to know what you're getting out of it. It's not I don't think it's a place where you go just to get a degree, right? I think the intentionality is really important because it also changes where you go and why you might be there. So I won't go into the, like the details of like the University of Michigan program and that kind of thing. In a general sense, it's like a 2-year-ish program. The summer between year 1 and year 2, they fund they did, I don't know what they do now, but they fund a research project where you can travel. What would you say are some of the highlights or milestones that you achieved through that program? You already had a bit of a studio practice prior to going. That's very different from me. University of Michigan introduced a studio practice to me, like actually having a space and a home to like work out of like long term. So I'm curious, like, what were some of your big takeaways or milestones of being in that program that maybe still apply to your practice today?
Yeah, I mean, space. The studios that I had previously, like I said, I was always sort of like using framing and panel making and other freelance jobs to sort of pay for the space. So the spaces that I had some sweet spaces, but they were inevitably pretty modest, and the roof leaked, or I was sharing them with like super loud other sort of builders or fabricators, and studios would flood, or there wasn't heat, or so just having like a large, secure, dry, climate controlled space was like in a space you could leave stuff out.
Thank you for sharing that, by the way, because I know that someone's going to listen to this and feel like, oh, well, I can't afford a studio because studios are blah, blah, blah in terms of how expensive. But there's a little bit of everything out there for everyone. And your
Totally.
willingness to make concessions, like just to keep making or just to keep working, is really important.
Totally. I mean, my first spaces in Chattanooga were, one was the mud room that bled out onto the porch. And whenever the weather was nice, I would move my table saw out into the driveway. And yeah, I mean, that was like basically close to working in the woods. And then it was like, and then it was a 400 square space. And then it was a, 600 square space. And so, yeah, it's like, it started out very modest, and then figured out how to pay for that. And then that figured out how to pay for that. Yeah. But so the University of Michigan sort of like faculty grad studios building was a massive building with like super tall ceilings, and it had a wood shop and a metal shop, and in addition to your own small private office kind of studio next to it. So, I mean, that was just having that steady access was great. the having regular studio visits was really, I think, really sweet, because I was in artist communities in the different places, but it was, at Stamps, sort of, we were having folks come in from all over the country, all over the world, with and because it was an interdisciplinary program, every artist or creative that came through sort of had a wildly different perspective
Yeah.
about making things, or what art could be, or what art should be. And so at every turn you were sort of forced to consider, well, what is the fashion designer, how do they relate to a large scale awning sculpture, or
Yeah.
what are the commonalities here. And so that was really key. um, Having an advisor was really important, somebody that you were checking in with regularly, even if you didn't always sort of like see eye to eye
Yeah.
about everything. It was an opportunity for you to
Like,
sort
I
of
hear
know,
you.
yeah, I hear you, but I feel differently, and this is why.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, space and community were really, um, really important. And then, another thing about Michigan that I was interested in is its proximity to Detroit.
Yeah.
My work has always been interested in aspects of the built environment and architecture, and Detroit, um, you know, holds a really sort of like interesting place in American history, sort of within sort of the built landscape. But I didn't realize how complicated it might be as an outsider to come in and think of Detroit as some like art making playground, which it's not. It's a real space with real people and real stories, and um, real traumas and all
Yeah.
of those things. And so it was, I thought Detroit would be this major draw for going to University of Michigan. Realized pretty quickly that it was more complicated than that. But in the commuting from Ann Arbor area to Detroit, I realized that actually this kind of these spaces in between,
Yeah.
these sort of commuter thoroughfares, look a lot like the sort of rapidly suburbanizing sort of like area that I grew up in South Carolina. It's like, maybe this is a space to kind of start paying attention to. And so that ended up being kind of one of the most important aspects of grad school at University of Michigan for me, were those kind of strange commutes between those two very different places.
So by time you graduated from University of Michigan, and I'm asking this question in contrast to how you might have been not even describing your work prior to, but just thinking about the type of work that you might want to make in your areas of interest. By the time you left University of Michigan, how were you thinking about your artwork or describing your artwork? Like, what's that like? What was your elevator pitch, if you will, for what does Shane do?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was like trying to locate the garden-esque and the sort of the transcendent within the sort of commercial banal landscapes. I was like trying to identify. I had, through the academic work within the university, was learning about the sort of aspirations of sort of city planning, and the way sort of like cities would be mapped out, and the way the suburbs were sort of like grew to sort of like encapsulate the garden-esque, and then sort of like seeing the sort of the pretty shoddy um, like applications of that kind of spatial design in your classic sort of suburban strip mall. Um, so I was trying to sort of like remarry those two ideas, like to find the sort of the to find the garden-esque and the sort of the transcendent within these kind of run-of-the-mill banal spaces.
And in your work now, I mean, I consider you to be an installation artist. Do you utilize that terminology for yourself, or do you see yourself as more of a sculpture artist or combinate somewhere in between, like
I think it
sculpture
changes.
installation?
Yeah, whoever I'm asking, or whoever I'm talking to, or whoever asks. But uh, sort of, I will tell folks I'm a sculptor and photographer who works a lot in installation. Um, that ends up sort of being, yeah, what?
What most people get.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah,
think so.
no, that makes sense. I mean, I think it's fascinating. Where can people find your work, by the way? Like, where can they see it?
I'm on Instagram at Shane Darwent, and then I have a website, shanedarwent.com, and yeah, those would be the two places.
I
Yeah.
think it's always been fascinating. Looking at your sculptures has always felt familiar. Um, and I think for me, that's just because of where I grew up in South Florida. So very familiar with that strip mall vibe, those like in between commuter spaces. You know, like I didn't grow up in like West Palm Beach or Miami, but
Mm.
that small town in between has
Mhm.
glimpses and pieces of all of these like big city feels.
Mhm.
That you start to kind of see these commonalities. So it's been very cool to see you. I'm always fascinated when an artist can take such like a simple element of what
Mhm.
we're used to seeing. And I call it simple because we see it every day. It's like we're not even conscientious of it. And then you
Totally.
give it a new life and a new meaning for us to have a whole new dialogue and conversation about it.
For me, that's sort of yeah, that's the goal with trying to sort of like dig into these spaces that feel very um, standardized, as sort of that, growing up in South Florida or South Carolina or Detroit or now in Oklahoma, we all have those spaces, and definitely don't want to say that they're all the same, but they all share
For sure.
um, these kind of like base architectural sort of like elements. And so it's trying to sort of um, it's a desperate attempt on my end to try to spend time in there and sort of like pull out some of the nuance, or some of the idiosyncrasies, um, between the different places or within these different architectural features.
All right. So you've graduated from University of Michigan. How soon after did you get this Tulsa Fellowship? Did you stick around um, in Michigan for a little bit? What was that process? What were you looking for, even like postgraduate school? Obviously, it's like, all right, time to make money.
Yeah, yeah,
Where you're like, time to like continue this right outside of the academic space. So what is it that you were looking for? What did you find in the Tulsa Fellowship? And yeah, just let me know what's happened since then.
yeah. So we had this great professional practice seminar at University of Michigan in the last semester while we were working on our thesis, and that was taught by Stephanie Rowden. And we did, it sounds a little cheesy, but we did the sort of the visioning board.
Yeah.
Where do you want to be in 2, 5, 10 years? Um, and I remember sort of like thinking of the 5 year sort of vision. I want to be in, somewhat post-industrial sort of mid-sized city, working in and around other artists, sort of on a project-to-project basis. I don't want to be teaching. I want my studio work to be my focus, and so that was sort of the vision. And to get there, my wife and I were sort of like building out where we had been gifted a spreadsheet with residencies,
Nice.
artist residencies, and I was specifically interested in the longer term artist residencies. You know,
More money, more benefits.
Yeah, and just a chance to sort of dig into a place a little bit longer. I think we had sort of like bounced all around for the last like 12 years, and I think we were ready to sort of at least be in a spot for a year. Um, and so there's not that when you're looking for that narrows it pretty quickly. There's like maybe 4 or 5 different residencies in the country that are sort of 9 months or longer. So there's not that many. One was in Houston, the core program. One was in Galveston, just down the road from Houston. that both of those were 9 months. There was one in Roswell, New Mexico, that was like 9 months or a year. And then there was this new one called the Tulsa Artist Fellowship in Tulsa that was 3 years. And so I basically applied to all four of those. And the the Tulsa Fellowship, the one with actually the best kind of package, is the one that I was lucky enough to get into.
Nice.
I was applying in that thesis semester of grad school, in the final semester, which was a lot to try to do. But there were a lot of other folks that were also like applying for teaching gigs and even hitting the application trail even harder, which I totally understand, but it's not what I wanted to put my energy into. I wanted to sort of really put my energy into the thesis, but also try to sort of bank a little bit of energy for what might happen post thesis. So I, scrambled together to get those four applications out. And like I said, got the Tulsa Fellowship, which wasn't going to start until January 2018 and was graduating in May 2017. And so I had that sort of that next 6 months to sort of figure out what to do with, and a lot of grad students from University of Michigan end up teaching a semester or two at Adrian College, which is just down the road from about an hour away from Ann Arbor. And Elspeth, my wife, happened to be the gallery director there.
Nice.
And I knew a couple of sort of like previous cohorts who had been teaching sculpture and professional practice classes there. So I picked up a couple sections of intro to 3D design, and then professional practice. And then I was freelancing, doing preparator stuff at the Stamps Gallery. And then I also had, I was going to be in a triennial at the Windsor Museum of Art across the river from Detroit in Windsor, Canada. So that kind of like, I wanted to sort of like come out of grad school and have that sort of like diversified pie chart, if you will, of like different, both sort of like different ways of making money still within the arts, but then also other opportunities where I could get additional funding to work on my own projects. So I was able to sort of like have a couple of shows outside of grad school sort of in that first 6 months, but then also sort of like a few different ways of cobbling together some dough to be able to move to Tulsa.
Did you all do like a cross-country drive kind of thing?
We kind of did it in pieces, because Elspeth still had some shows that she had that appointment through the spring of 2018, I think. Okay. So she still had a couple of shows in the early part of 2018, and I did one drive down with my truck in the dead of winter with some studio equipment, and then we did like a full-on like 26-foot U-Haul truck with like everything that we owned, including a canoe and some awning sculptures, and then we just like parked that thing in sort of like downtown Tulsa. And I think a lot of the artists in residence here were like, what the hell are you doing? Like, look at these yahoos. Yeah. Other folks were sort of coming to do the Tulsa Artist Fellowship. They were like on sabbatical from this, from Duke or wherever, or sort of, had their sort of their teaching or academic sort of jobs in other places. And they were just going to come and spend a year or two here. But we just like, loaded the U-Haul and just showed up, one-way ticket, kind of got here, and we're like, all right, here we are.
Nice.
So we kind of, we just showed up sort of like fully, without any reservations, really not knowing. We had never really been to Tulsa. We didn't know anything about it other than sort of the kind of surface research you do when moving to a place. And so, we just kind of showed up ready to sort of be a part of whatever was happening.
Now, did your residency time end up getting extended? Like, what were What were the expectations of you during those 3 years, and what kept you for another three?
So I was the third cohort to be a part of the fellowship, and in those early years, the sort of the vision of the fellowship was to invite artists to Tulsa to live and work for 3 years,
Okay.
just a flat 3 years. I would say halfway through my 3 years, we took on a new director, and the structure changed kind of overnight to being just a 2-year program. But then at the end of that 2 years, you can apply with a public-facing sort of project that would occupy a certain amount of your studio time for that next year.
Okay.
And they were calling these arts integration grants. So it was almost like the social practice arm of your studio work. And I think for some artists, it sort of came more naturally than others, but they're really wanting to sort of like get artists out of their studios and engaging with the sort of the communities across Tulsa to sort of just be more present and be more connected to, to the scene, I guess. And so I was lucky enough to, towards the end of my first like block of fellowship time before this new arts integration sort of opportunity, I had received my first public art project to create a series of sculptures and sort of plaza design for the USA BMX headquarters that was moving to Tulsa. And they were moving into this sort of the southeast corner of the historic sort of Greenwood neighborhood.
What is that, by the way, the USB?
So if folks haven't heard of Greenwood, they probably heard of Black Wall Street.
Yeah.
And it was basically this sort of like thriving sort of super sort of commercially diverse sort of Black district in downtown Tulsa that was dubbed sort of Black Wall Street in the sort of like the early part of the 20th century, and it's basically it's so hard to sort of like distill into a minute, but as is sort of the case whenever sort of like Black folks get sort of power, white folks get
you're thriving too much. That's a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
You're thriving without me. What?
Exactly. Yeah, and it was like this sort of like there was this idea that sort of like the dollar spent in Greenwood would sort of be exchanged sort of like 40 different times within sort of like
Wow.
Greenwood within a day. It was it was just an incredible sort of example of sort of like Black excellence and sort of entrepreneurship. Well, in 1921, there was a trumped up sort of like incident of racial violence. There was a young white woman who was an elevator operator, and there was a young Black man who did deliveries, sort of postal deliveries, sort of downtown. And within the elevator, the story goes, the elevator sort of like shook around. The sort of Dick Rowland, the young Black man, sort of was seen sort of like in some physical proximity to the young white woman. There's all these sort of like allegations that he was assaulting her. The other side of the story is that they actually had some kind of like relationship. Anyway, he was thrown into jail, and then an angry white mob wanted to sort of break him out of jail and hang him. And then a number of Black World War I vets went to defend him, to make sure that he wasn't taken out of prison. Anyway, a kerfuffle ensued. Shots were fired. That sort of set the stage for what would become the largest single race-based incident of violence in the United States, where white mobs stormed Greenwood this thriving Black neighborhood, and basically burned and bombed the neighborhood almost to the ground. 40 square blocks of the neighborhood were basically leveled.
Wow.
And anyway, this legacy, we were sort of coming
Is that
up on
modern day, like downtown Tulsa right now?
it is. It's right. So the
Okay.
Tulsa Artist Fellowship is right
You're in the heart of that.
in the heart of that.
Wow.
So when I first moved to Tulsa, you would be walking around, and they had this kind of beautiful sort of anti-monument, sort of acknowledging all of the businesses and sort of structures that were lost to the Tulsa Race Massacre, as it's known. And basically, you'd have these like small little sort of like bronze plaques in the ground in front of where the business was, and it would sort of tell you what was there, what happened to it, and whether or not it's rebuilt.
Gotcha.
So you would just be sort of like walking around sort of this neighborhood that now has coffee shops and sort of, marketing agencies and a baseball field, and you would just be sort of walking across, an endless series of plaques towards what was there. Anyway, that's the sort of the context for where USA BMX chose to move its headquarters, Olympic-sized sort of race course, Hall of Fame, offices for the organization. And so naturally they wanted an artwork that was going to commemorate this history, but they also wanted to merge that history with the exciting sport of BMX, and for it to be a selfie backdrop for the citizens of Tulsa, and all of the ridiculous things that public art projects sort of like want you to sort of
check all the boxes.
Exactly. So, I mean, yeah, we haven't mentioned this, but one of my sort of like avenues into art making was getting a camera to photograph my friends' BMX and skateboard growing up.
Okay. So that was a full circle moment for you then.
100%. I mean, it was the only thing that made me think, well, this is a ridiculous request for proposals, but having sort of like been on this journey that kind of started from a BMX bike whenever I was like 13 or 14, like that has been my tool for mobility in all the senses through this life.
I love that.
And so it was this chance, and my father, who had actually passed just months before I started the Tulsa Artist Fellowship, sort of like worked in concrete construction, did large scale sort of like architectural projects. And so it was a chance for me to sort of like bring that kind of like sort of construction ambition, bring the material of concrete, and sort of this sort of sensitivity to the neighborhood and understanding of sort of the culture of BMX, sort of like bring them all together. So I built a team with a couple of local folks, because not being from Tulsa, that seemed really important to me, and I'm really glad that I did.
Kudos.
And but I kind of served as artist lead, and we created a series of sculptures that sort of that are these like kind of tall concrete columns that are stamped with a low relief brick pattern on the outside. All of the buildings in Greenwood were brick. The brick rubble was like a very much sort of a symbol of the race massacre. But also the standing chimneys left after the bombings and the sort of the burnings of the buildings were also this kind of really poignant symbol that the hearth to these homes were still standing, So it was like a chance to sort of like merge these kind of this brick material with these kind of like upward sort of chimney sentinel like forms. And that was going to be the anchor to the plaza. So going back to this arts integration project through the Tulsa Artist Fellowship, I was working on this public art commission at the time, and I said, well, wouldn't it be incredible to do a sort of a micro public history bicycle series where we look at different themes that have influenced this really specific pocket of Greenwood, and do a series of bike rides that highlight different aspects of this.
Nice.
So I worked with one of my project partners to put this together, and we did over the course of 3 weekends one year, 3 consecutive weekends in May, sort of leading up to the centennial, the 100th sort of commemoration of the massacre. We did a series of bike rides that partnered with scholars and chefs and Black entrepreneurs to highlight issues surrounding sort of like food access, food insecurity, the infrastructure, meaning sort of the highways and the railroads and all of the sort of like built environment sort of touchstones that shape what the neighborhood looks like now. And then also the sort of the next wave of Black artists and Black creatives and Black entrepreneurs that have sort of like taken this legacy of Greenwood into the future. Anyway, so that was my foray into social practice as it related to my work. And I have since done 2 or 3 different other sort of public-facing projects as a part of the Tulsa Artist Fellowship. So I just finished the fellowship after 6 years of being in it, and have done about 3.5, 4 of these kind of concentrated public-facing projects.
So now you're really just an artist living and working in Tulsa.
Yeah.
No fellowship tied.
Well, I'm still in their studio for the moment. Until the spring, they gave us a sort of a soft, slow exit ramp, which has been really sweet.
So what are you thinking about? I'm going to ask you practical money making questions. So what are you thinking about now that this fellowship is like really done? You've got this kind of time period to like exit their existing studio. What are you looking at in terms of relocating studios, just financially supporting your practice? I know you've done a couple art fairs since being in Tulsa. I don't know if those were lucrative for you, were they, or were they like exposure points for you that just kind of brought future money making opportunities?
Yeah, the art fairs they were always sort of like experimental projects in offsite locations. I still haven't sort of like done like a proper fair. Like I show with the gallery in New York, and they're now starting to sort of apply for and do some fairs. But the fair activity that I've done has always been sort of more fringe. Around the fair weeks, there's all sorts of really exciting sort of like pop-up shows.
Yeah,
exactly. That are less obviously commercial, but still everybody's trying to sort of like take advantage of a critical mass of people being in town. So and I'm still interested in those, especially living in Tulsa. It's like it's been a good place to have as a base camp, but it only works if you get out and leave and sort of jump into sort of the art scene in other places.
Yeah.
So, on the finishing up, fortunately, I always wanted the fellowship to sort of help my studio get to sustainability. And it has one project at a time. The BMX project that I was mentioning, I worked on it for like 2.5 years and I made like $4,000.
Wow.
So I basically like a very labor intensive sort of exposure campaign.
For just 4,000.
Yeah. So it doesn't pay for anything. But because the fellowship was covering my my studio rent and housing, that I was able to sort of like take that risk and say, okay, I'm going to sort of really invest 100% of this into the project,
Yeah.
and know that that will sort of pay off down the line, and give people confidence in me to sort of work on other projects of scale. And the same is true for all of the sort of experimental offsite art fair projects. Those were certainly sort of a way to sort of build a network, to show folks that I could work on large scale projects all over the country, and sort of like do them in sort of relatively sort of crazy circumstances, short, working periods of time. And so those have led to projects that have actually allowed me to make money. I was able to do this, wild collaboration with Saint Laurent in the fall of 2022. Fashion has a massive budget. And so all of the projects over the years that I have done and said yes to that were fully speculative, or where I spent a lot of my own money for exposure and no actual hard return on that investment, that all through that one project kind of paid for itself. Made it worth it.
Was the collaboration or commission, I mean, technically it was like a commission from St. Laurent. Is that something that somebody put your name in the hat for? Is that something that you were seeking? I think it's fascinating that you were able to tap into the fashion industry with your work.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. So actually I did, to back it up just a little bit, I had done sort of like Spring Break Art Show in New York.
Okay. Yes, I remember that.
Yeah, the year after graduating from University of Michigan grad program. And that's how I met the gallery that I still show with in New York, Spencer Brownstone. And that's also how I met a bunch of folks who do these kind of like interesting offsite projects in Miami during sort of like the art fair week there. So the second show that I had with Spencer Brownstone in New York was a series of all black awning sculptures. And that show was like critically well received. We got written up by the New York Times, by Art Papers, and by ArtNet. So it was like really exciting in all of those ways, but we didn't sell a thing. And we actually had to like cut apart some of those sculptures. I wasn't able to go deinstall them. They put some in storage, but awnings are big and they don't collapse. And, it's just impractical to store everything. But months later, some art consultants who are Paris-based and work with Saint Laurent, the fashion house, reached out to me and said, hey, we're putting together a list of international artists to present to the creative director of Saint Laurent's for this new artist collaboration series that they're developing. These are the dates. This is the budget. You don't have to do anything at this point. We just want to know if we can include you and your work in this presentation that we're making.
Yes, please.
Yes. I 100% thought it was a scam. But I was like, what do I got to lose? This is incredible. I'll never get the call back, but it's good to know that I can be in Tulsa and not completely out on all the action. So then, like a month later, they reached back out and they said, hey, you're one of two artists that we would like to sort of pay to create a proposal, an actual proposal now for.
It's nice. Paid to create a proposal.
Amazing. Yes. Because with all of these like public projects, and at this point I had sort of like applied to like maybe 4, and the only one I had gotten was the BMX one. They pay you like $1,000, but you'll spend like a month full time working on a proposal like that, unless you've done it a million times and then you know how to sort of streamline it. But so it's another sort of basically pro bono situation. But with YSL, they were going to pay us $3,000 to put together a proposal.
Nice.
In a week. And we only had a week. It was like really short, sort of like turnaround. So I just sort of like, leaned into it as hard as I could. And then basically I got the job. And so over the course of like 5 months in 2022, created a series of 25 site-specific sculptures for them for, everywhere from the Bergdorf Goodman windows in Manhattan to all of their major international storefronts, which was just absolutely bonkers. But that project has sort of like now become sort of like another sort of like feather in the cap, like BMX was, to prove to other organizations that I can take on large scale projects,
Yeah.
short timelines and large budgets and
International at that. Yeah.
Exactly. So coordinating shipping and crating and all of that kind of stuff. So now that's led to most recently the commission that's sort of occupying me is a really big commission for the Tulsa International Airport.
Ooh.
Yeah, I'm super excited. We're hoping to install this May, but it's like 120-foot long installation of colored resin panels that are all connected to a motor hidden in the ceiling, and they rotate but are slightly offset from one to the next. So it creates almost like this kind of wave-like motion from sort of one end to the next, and the colors are based off of the sort of like the like golden hour of like dawn and dusk.
Nice.
So those like referencing the sort of the sky that you can see from a plane, that's sort of this beautiful gradient that you can see there that you can't see anywhere else. Getting a project like the St. Laurent Commission was really influential to sort of talk to to pitch to the airport and sort of say, hey, I can do this and this is why. So we're here for now. I've got this big airport project that I'm working on. A part of the Venn diagram is also doing a series of private commissions for for local clients here in town.
Nice.
Whether it's sort of like a sculptural mural for their, insane pool that they're building in their backyard, to a freestanding sculpture in their front yard.
Do you find that you're having to, or have you been in the practice since you've been there of just like marketing yourself and what your skill sets are so that when people need something, they know who to call? Or has it been more so people reaching out based on what they are seeing you do?
It's been a slow like expansion of my own network. So it's less like hitting the pavement and being like, I'm the guy to do a bronze sculpture for your front yard, but it's more sort of like being as present as I can, saying yes to lots of local opportunities that I know aren't going to add up to anything in that moment, in like a one-to-one thing. But you do the
add
pop
to your Rolodex of things that you've done, and then people you've worked with, so your network grows and your portfolio grows too.
Totally. I think, you do this sort of experimental pop-up warehouse show downtown, and it's like somebody here sees it and it gets their gears turning. So it all sort of ends up sort of influencing the next. I did do like a big sort of experimental awning sculpture in a warehouse here that is totally impractical to own. It's like a 20-foot tall sort of like series of, like leaning sort of awnings nesting into each other. But an interior designer saw it. He was like, who is this like wild person making totally impractical massive sculpture? So we built a relationship. He does, insane bespoke interior design for all the wealthy clientele here in town. And so he invited me to do a project for his backyard, which I gave him like a super cut rate deal on, because I was like, if this goes well, then we're going to work together again in the future. I just know it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened. That project went well. We're now working on our third site-specific commission, um, sort of with him as the interior designer who has the client relationships, bringing me on to do sort of a custom one-off sort of like piece.
Do you find yourself adjusting your rates on like a seasonal or annual kind of basis, or is it kind of situational in terms of like maybe what the budget is, or just as you get more opportunities, that's inherently increasing your value as an artist too?
I think, I think a bit of all of those. I think sort of as I've been able to do these larger profile projects, it's allowed me to be more confident in commanding a certain amount. But I'm also like fresh off the heels of like trying to do projects and keep them within a certain budget, and then that just totally like biting me in the ass. Clients don't like to say, no matter how rich they are, sort of like my impulse initially was to be like, well, what's your budget? What are we working with? And then I can reverse engineer.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wants you to sort of like come up
well,
with,
you tell me.
exactly. You tell me. I want the most complicated, crazy project, but I also want it to sort of be cheaper than, it's just like they want it all. And lots of times sort of like clients with means doesn't necessarily sort of mean that they want to spend $100,000 on a project, even though they spent $75,000 on their section.
They want a really cool thing at like the best value, and the best value is whatever number that they feel good about at the time.
Exactly. So I'm still sort of like learning how to navigate that. I did 3 private commissions last year, and I think it was like enough for me to realize, okay, like I don't need to say yes to everything, and I only have, life is short. There's only a certain period of time that I have to sort of make my own work.
Yeah.
And I don't want this to fully, it could very easily be just like, that's the full-time thing. I'm just doing sort of like private commissions, which are exciting, but it's inevitably you can't experiment in the same ways that you can.
Because it's a commission.
Because it's a commission.
Yeah, you're answering to somebody.
Exactly. It's got to function in a really specific way. So
in this time, where do you feel like I don't want to call it rate, because that is going to fluctuate depending on what the project is, and it's not necessarily I spent 40 hours on this kind of thing.
Yeah.
But in a general sense, like we'll call it the profit you've made from either commissions or projects. Where would you say that started when you got to Tulsa compared to where you are now?
Yeah. For these private commissions, or like for the public projects, or
either.
Yeah. Well, with the BMX project, I made like, that was $100,000 budget, and like I said, I made like maybe $4,000, so like 4% on that, which is like not good. And I think like sort of a standard rule of thumb for sort of like a large public project is for the artist to sort of like carve away like 15 to 20%. I would, hopefully 15% at minimum. If you can get closer to 20%, I think that's great. So the airport project that I'm working on now has a $250,000 budget, and I'm definitely hoping to make 20% on that. But and things are in good shape for that, but there's still a lot of contingency and a lot sort of that could happen between now and then that
right.
That we realize, oh, we need gearboxes, or we need
and all that starts to chip away at that. Yeah,
totally. With the private commissions, I'm still trying to figure out how those numbers break down. I've I always go into it being like, oh, well, if I can carve like $10,000 to $12,000 for myself out of this, I know that I'm going to be the project manager for this, This is going to be a project that happens over the course of like a year, 18 months. So it's a kind of a lot of time. It's a lot of working with fabricators.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's your own sort of like design and commission in there.
Yep.
So I've realized that with those numbers, maybe 10 to 12,000 or 10 to 15,000 is okay for, like, say your artist commission, but that doesn't translate to the hours spent project managing.
Yes. Thank
So
you
I'm
for mentioning
realizing
that, because those are
yeah,
different hats that you're wearing,
totally,
direction to you're the fabricator.
totally. Yeah, I've realized with this next one that I'm trying to bid out soon, like, okay, there's a number that's artist honorarium, or my own commission as artist, and then there should be a separate number that's like as if I was paying somebody else to be the project manager to see this through. What would I need to pay them? And if that's me, then I'm actually paying myself for that labor, because I've just
Anything
been
could happen, like you could be sick, or maybe you're not able to perform the functions of that role. So I
totally.
love that. I think more artists need to consider that when creating their project budgets, because I think, and you already talked about it, sometimes it's a confidence thing too. So as you do it more, like you get more confident in that and like asserting yourself. But it's also just calling it out. Like if something happened to you and you couldn't project manage and you needed to outsource that, what would that cost you?
Yep.
If something happened, you have these tools and you have the skill set, so you can be the fabricator. But maybe you've got to do something for your family, or you're not available to, or that tool of
Yep.
yours goes out, that you
Yep.
had. Like all of that matters, like I'm always considering my camera and my technical costs. Yes, I own it, but at any point in time it could go out. So am I
Totally.
out $1,000 because I got to get a new camera?
Totally.
Out of like what should have been my profit, or was I planning
Yep.
accordingly? It's like
Yep.
renting from yourself.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's like a really good way of putting it. I had somebody. Yeah, I work with fabricators for a lot of these bigger projects, and I had somebody give me numbers recently for a project, and I was debating of like whether am I outsourcing this to a fabricator or am I doing this in house. And I realized that like if I'm outsourcing it, which I just may as well do, despite everything I'm going to say, but that the numbers that they're charging me include their overhead. They include machine maintenance. They include the rent that they're paying and the utilities that they're paying. And I realized, oh, like if I was doing this in-house, then I'm paying myself all of those sort of consumable
Yeah.
costs. But in the past, when I've thought about that, I'm just like, oh no, like I need to make roughly this. And it's just a number that I pull out of the blue that sounds good at the beginning. You're like, yeah, I'm going to make $10,000 on this commission.
And then $10,000 goes quick once you actually start like paying the bills of what
Yeah,
you thought that was going to cover.
and you stretch it out over like a year and a half, and you're like, oh, I made like $800 a month for sort of like realizing this like monumental, one of a kind sculpture for a really wealthy client. Like,
Yeah.
no, that's not cool.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm pumped. I love the trajectory of your work, and what you've done with it. I think so many other artists can learn a lot. I hope people learn a lot from your story, and from the experiences that you've had. I think you're also underscoring for me personally, like public art's hard. And I think it's a bummer that it's hard. I think that municipalities maybe make it more difficult than it needs to be, because there's so much money and opportunity in public art. But in terms of like, I don't know, maybe those things tend to go to the same types of people, or they're looking for proof that you can handle either that size budget or their needs of that project. It can be difficult to land, but it is one of those things that one begets another. And that's very clear in like the work that you've done, over those 6 years, and the gaps between you getting those, knowing that, you've been applying to others and things like that. But the right one will come for you for sure. And it's great to see that have happened for you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, a lot of speculative labor, trust that it will add up to something sometime somewhere.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. So closing words. What feedback or advice might you have for artists? Maybe either wanting to work in Tulsa or work in a similar space that you are. Between photography, sculpture, and sometimes that looking like installation.
Yeah. Well, I this isn't related to like the processes specifically so much, but I think
Oh,
back of
that's fine.
um, I think back to sort of some advice that one of my sort of photo professors gave me in undergrad, where I was given the opportunity to show sort of a body of work after one of our projects in the basement of the building on campus at Micah, of the sort of the main building. It was called. I think that's what it was called. Anyway, it was in the photo department, and I sort of mounted what I thought was sort of like a super tight sort of like installation series of photos. But when I was like sort of hanging one of the pieces, I sort of was like putting a T-pin over some glass, and a little tiny corner of the glass chipped off. And I was like, oh, well, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's in the basement, otherwise the project looks pretty good. And she liked the work, but she was like, this is pretty slack. You need to treat every single opportunity as if it was at the Museum of Modern Art, like no matter
Like
where it is.
presentation wise.
Exactly. See it all the way through. And I think that little bit of advice is sort of like kind of followed me like sort of a little voice on my shoulder, sort of at every turn. Sometimes, for better, for worse. But it's like that kind of like standard to myself that I've tried to sort of like uphold. And whether it's like the experimental sort of show in your local downtown, or it's the sort of it's the storefront window of Saint Laurent in Dubai. It all is like a training ground. It's like it all the standards you set for yourself become the standards, whatever the venue is. Yeah, and I guess to sort of like to end with thinking about a place like Tulsa. I mean, it's been um, it's been exciting to be a part of growing something, and to be a sort of like making work in a space where we kind of need all the artists at the table to be doing is all the things. And every time I've lived in New York, I felt like it was like, oh, you're an artist, like get to the back of the line, like there's a million of you, whatever. But working in a place like this, it's like, oh, you're an artist, like what kind of work do you make? Where can I see it? That's so cool. Why are you here?
Yeah.
And so I think it's less about sort of like being a big fish in a small pond, and more about sort of like being in a space where they're excited to have you, and you're excited to sort of like expand the conversation,
For sure.
and be a part of growing something. So it's allowed me to sort of like take risks in the work, make work at scale, and as long as I can get it to places like New York or Miami or LA, um, you know, then you can make it happen in a space like this.
Well, thank you so much, Shane. It was great catching up and hearing, all of just more detail about all the amazing things that you've done. It's been a while since we've been able to catch up, and I'm really pumped to see what you do next, and where you might find yourself next, both you and Elsbeth. So, yeah, congratulations for an amazing career so far. And it's only going to get better. So, kudos to
Cheers
you.
to that. Cheers to that. Well, thanks so much, Stephanie. You've always kept a million balls in the air, and that's inspiring. And so, yeah, thanks for the invitation to chat.
Yeah, thanks for coming. All right, thank you all for tuning in to another episode of the In Between Artists podcast. We'll catch you on the next one.